Thank you, Suhail. Thank you for coming. Yeah. So, Suhail suggested that I warn you all that it might be slightly longer tonight. My talk. Not your whole evening. Just my bit. You'll still leave at 6:30. I might still be talking. My name's Theo Turpin, and I'm a writer and an artist and a researcher. And the presentation tonight is called Transmedia World Building and the Chance of Futurity. And it's conceived in a way as a sort of proposed methodology, a kind of suggestion of a way to think about art and perhaps creative practices more broadly, through highlighting a set of tools that are proposed in transmedia storytelling, as a way to imagine practice as world building. So I'm going to talk about some of these kind of key ideas and highlight some other artists who are kind of using those things, alongside talking about my own work, kind of more towards the end, how I'm kind of addressing it through my own practice as research. If you see pictures and they're not attributed to anyone, then my work just to make it more visual. So world building. So firstly, I thought it would probably be good to talk a little bit about what we mean when we say world building, because in the last few years, world building has become quite a popular term, more in contemporary art. It's being applied in contemporary art quite a bit. But there's kind of three different broad but interconnected kind of things that people might be saying when they say world building. So the first is the one that I'm going to be dealing with most, which is kind of comes from storytelling. So in storytelling, world building is most closely kind of related to the sort of speculative fiction, science fiction, kind of fantasy canon. And it's I've got a useful kind of quote to describe it here, by a film theorist called Dudley Andrews, who says, "Worlds are comprehensive systems which comprise all elements that fit together within the same horizon, including elements that are before our eyes in the foreground of experience and those which sit vaguely in the horizon, forming a background. These elements consist of objects, feelings, associations, and ideas in a grand mix so rich that only the term world seems large enough to encompass it." So it's kind of, in storytelling, it's the production of these kind of complex, interconnected systems of place, character, and emotion within which things may happen and an audience may be immersed. It's probably also, at this moment, maybe I think worth just highlighting a distinction that I'm going to be making, which kind of comes from actually the framing, or is extra important because of the framing that Suhail's provided, which is I'm going to use the term story rather than narrative, even though the study of stories is often referred to as narratology. So I'm going to try to use the term story and not narrative, because when we talk about narrative in this context of the conversation we're having here, we're probably talking about a bigger societal concept, which may include a certain kind of set of socially prescribed moral codes and trajectories. And what we're talking here about stories is something imagination-led and probably much smaller. So that's just a sort of linguistic, semantic difference that I may slip up and say narrative. But I'm going to try not to. So, there's a typical, in world building, in story worlds, there's a typical distinction made between what's called this kind of authored secondary world, and our lived primary world. And Mark J. P. Wolf, who's a kind of literary theorist, he says the secondary worlds use material from the primary world, reshaping and recombining elements from it, so that the end result is both recognizable but also new and different. So in a way, this kind of distinction is intended just to highlight not just the differences, but also similarities that you'd feel in a kind of experience in a story world. For example, we would expect in a story that like a character will breathe oxygen unless you have been told that they don't breathe oxygen. This is kind of simple. We rely on like primary world mechanics to create these secondary worlds. So it's just kind of a kind of useful or like kind of an important tool in the kind of thinking around story worlds. So it's therefore with a kind of sense of shared worldness that brings both the audience and the author together in embracing this kind of new world, the story world. But to consider, being that this is a kind of methodology tonight, what goes into making a narrative world. I'm going to just talk about a little kind of proposition by Elizabeth Klastrup and Susanna Tosca, who suggested that what characterizes this world, the story world, is the shared idea of worldness that the audience and authors have. And they created kind of what's quite useful from a art making perspective, or just the perspective of production. They suggested that all story worlds are made up of kind of three distinct elements: a mythos, topos, and ethos. The mythos is the establishing conflicts of the world, which also presents the characters. The mythos also includes stories of or rumours about certain lore and creatures which are unique to the world. One could say that the mythos of the world is the backstory of all backstories, the central knowledge one needs to have in order to interact with or interpret events in the world successfully. The topos is the kind of outline of a physical and to some extent cultural specifics of the world. In genre fiction, you could kind of imagine this as like techno-futurism or fantasy historicity of the story world settings, this kind of granular detail. And the ethos, the explicit and implicit ethics of the world and moral codex of behaviour, which characters in the world are supposed to follow. How does the good and the bad behave, and what behaviour can be accepted as in character or rejected as out of character in that world. Thus, ethos is the form of knowledge required in order to know how to behave in the world. So I wanted to mention these ideas because, as I say, I'm imagining this kind of tonight as a proposal for world building as a way of working. These ideas sort of illustrate how we might think about creating a space, one which contains a collection of elements which can be used to build a larger whole. And with this in mind, I thought perhaps it's also worth kind of bringing up an analogy which I think is quite useful in understanding world building, and has also became quite popular in recent years, which is Ursula Le Guin's carrier bag theory of as a narrative structure. And she says, prior to the preeminence of sticks, swords, and the hero's long, hard killing tools, our ancestors' greatest invention was the container. So in this kind of, with this idea, she suggests that we should imagine a story as a carrier bag or any other containing vessel, one in which all elements could be kept and cared for. And this, I think, is a way of thinking about building world, a space for the mythos, topos, and ethos, alongside kind of mood and ancestry and kin and these kinds of ideas. And this kind of critical use of world building, which is very much connected to its kind of narrativity and the critical potential of storytelling, also leads into ideas of worlding. So, Ursula Le Guin, alongside writers like Octavia Butler, are kind of quite useful examples of how speculative fiction can function as like a kind of critical tool. But when we talk about world building, and when people talk about world building more broadly in academia, but also in theorizing or placing contemporary art practice and production today, people are also often talking about worlding. And worlding is a kind of metaphysical idea that derives from Heidegger, in which he kind of says worlding is akin to human consciousness existing in a world of its own making. So for him, when he talks about worlding, it's kind of part of his, connects to his ideas of like Dasein and the idea that we are kind of, or the world is a product of our own kind of consciousness. But this notion of worlding as a kind of metaphysical idea was referenced or taken on by Gayatri Spivak, and they talk about the creation of colonized spaces. And this kind of leads into probably the other really like most productive, in a sense, by which I mean probably most spoken about, use of ideas of worlding and world building, which is in post-colonial studies. And so the use of Spivak, the use that Spivak made of the term has become quite key within that area, and is kind of exemplified in a discussion that certainly I have witnessed occurring within the art world, which is of a kind of discourse that John Law theorized as a distinction between the one world versus the many worlds. So the one world is predicated on the idea that the world carries on by itself. People do not perform it, it is outside of us, and we are contained inside it. And the proposition there is that the one world is a product of the global north, and therefore it is a form of world which is prescribed or forced upon other people, and which disallows what is described as the many worlds, which he would kind of place as being kind of time frames and temporalities of, for example, Indigenous and First Nations peoples. So, as we can kind of see, world building as an idea is quite like a rich place for finding tools for production and critique. And what I'm going to do, now that's a kind of like a little summation of world building, is I'm going to kind of set out now how we might look at these story mechanics to offer us ideas of how we might kind of use it in contemporary art. But first, as I mentioned, as I mentioned previously, the talk focuses on a kind of storied understanding of world building as a form of creative practice, and by this I kind of mean that it's a methodology rather than a reference or a subject. And while this may be applicable to creative practice quite broadly, tonight I want to focus on a type of contemporary art, an understanding of a kind of multidisciplinary contemporary art practice which exists across platforms. So I'm going to talk about some other artists in passing, pictured here: Isadora Pedro Neves Marquez, David Blandy, and Anna de Boer and Eloise Bonvieux. So what I want to propose here tonight is a way of looking or understanding this type of practice through a comparison to transmedia storytelling. So to do this, I'm going to highlight some of its key features while referring to artist practices, initially practices of these other people, and in the end my own, as a way to kind of make these ideas or kind of make these ideas kind of relevant to you all as people who work in producing or displaying or conceiving the interconnectivity of contemporary art. And then we can talk a bit more about that at the end, how I kind of look at it through my own work. But transmedia storytelling. So what is transmedia storytelling? So in its current usage, transmedia storytelling is a term that was coined by the media and fan scholar Henry Jenkins in 2006 in a book he wrote called Convergence Culture. And he said, more and more storytelling has become the art of world building, as artists create compelling environments that cannot be fully explored or exhausted within a single work or even a single medium. And Jenkins used this to give a kind of conceptual framework to what he saw as a growing trend within movies and TV to disperse various parts of a story across multiple platforms. And there were, of course, like previous to this, examples of storytelling which had like other outputs. But what he, like sort of spin-offs and parallel products and things like this, but what he quite successfully argued as being unique to that moment was that each additional element added or contained a new part of the narrative world and was designed to be distributed across multiple platforms. So, in 2006, he was talking about particularly things like the Blair Witch Project, which kind of interestingly, before they made, there was a kind of internet presence which proposed on a blog a kind of folklore around things that happen in the film. And he also talked a lot about The Matrix, which was conceived as a very large storytelling kind of vessel, which was designed beforehand to be told across 3 films and video games and some kind of like online material and kind of TV series. And it was designed so that you didn't need to have accessed all these bits of story to understand the whole story. But if you were, the way at least that Jenkins kind of saw it is that it was designed to reward this kind of a certain sort of engaged fandom where you sought out bits of this different kind of story world and you kind of put it together, and then you could kind of have the most rewarding sort of experience of this, and you become, as the audience, become a kind of, he described it as a kind of myth maker within the story world. And of course, since then, transmedia storytelling, transmediality has become very commonplace, and we see it in like lots of very, very big franchises. We see it in like the Star Wars Expanded Universe and all these kinds of things. They use a lot of transmediality, and it's and like things like The Witcher and things like this, and lots of like small things that people do as well. But the kind of conceptual innovation that Jenkins identified arose due to a combination of technologies and attitudes which, kind of in media terms, altered the means of both production and reception. So the logic of this type of storytelling, has become, as I say, quite commonplace, and it really, really relies very heavily on the idea of the audience. But what are the key qualities of transmediality? So I like this kind of quite simple definition by another film scholar called Elizabeth Evans, who described that the key elements of transmedia storytelling, the key kind of features, are temporality, fandom, and editability. So if we kind of combine this with Henry Jenkins' description of a story which unfolds across multiple platforms simultaneously, using the platform's key storied specificity, we begin to have quite a useful image of this kind of field to take forward and apply to contemporary art. So I'm going to just go through each of those 3 in a little bit to kind of unpack each of those 3 to think about how they work, the mechanics of them, and how they might apply to contemporary art. So temporality. So time in world building is often rather simplistically described as non-linear. And in many ways, this kind of gives a really false impression of like stories within worlds, within story worlds. Because of course, if you look at pretty much any story in a story world, there are periods of linearity in it. Mainly, the stories are told in periods of kind of linear story time. But, and we can see this in kind of all examples, really most examples. But what it's meant to highlight is the fact that from a kind of macro view, the elements of the story world that are made public or experienced by the public may not arrive in a constantly straight line. Story worlds are like interconnected nodes of story, following a kind of network logic, which allows for multiple instances of story which may or may not include the same characters or places becoming manifest. So time is therefore theorized within the world as not solely based on the progress of a single story, but of a much larger project of the world, and importantly, of the experience of the audience navigating that world. And this is certainly one of the unique qualities of a world, particularly as understood through transmedia storytelling. It's the idea of how the audience's experience of accessing and engaging with the story world creates time. Sometimes this manifests in a kind of reasonably manual fashion, so just like the audience member, like the act of the audience member moving through different platforms to access that information generates a form of storied time within the world. But also sometimes it's kind of very technologically like augmented or manifested. Kind of a very good example of that, or like a very simple example of that, is a phenomenon called second screening, which is like when people might like watch a live television broadcast and they will interact with it on their phones at the same time. So they might like be actively involved in some kind of like live blogging of what's happening, discussing what might happen, and sometimes those technologies have also been kind of incorporated into TV programs, particularly as a way to like facilitate like very like active audience engagement. I mean, probably the most obvious thing is like any kind of reality TV that like encourages people to vote for stuff. You know, that's like a really obvious example of second screening, but perhaps a bit less of world building. But so this builds in a certain type of active audience-produced time. Now, in contemporary art, the kind of primary mode of producing time is through the exhibition. What I refer to or will refer to as exhibition time. And it's perhaps best imagined as how storied time is experienced by a visitor to an exhibition. Now, this exhibition, it could contain something that is inherently time-based, such as like a video or audio work, which contains some trace of a story, perhaps. So, you know, it has a kind of definite inbuilt temporality. But what it means really more than that kind of time-based art, what's kind of particularly generative in terms of understanding time is actually the relationship between the viewer and all of the elements of the exhibition, the way that they navigate that. So, you know, that would include like the elements of art, the kind of objects which house people, furniture, things like this, information. And the narratologist, Mika Ball, who's written quite a lot about this, refers to it as exhibitionism. And she describes it as a kind of an eventness, as something that happens which is always temporally specific. And this is kind of an imagining of like eventness in the gallery. And she kind of frames this idea as a constellation in which the viewer, as I say, is provided with kind of spaces and facilities, furniture, information, art, in the form of like an event, like events or exhibitions or any other kind of manifestation, a public manifestation of exposition. And this is kind of generative of time, of a kind of audience-based time. So the inherent time then becomes a question of flow. The flow of the audience passing through the space of the exhibition, but also to view art practice in a kind of clearer, in a more kind of clearly contemporary manner. The flow of people as they access various elements of an artist's practice as it exists across platforms. So what we can kind of take with us in terms of time, is the idea of the audience as being the kind of active component here. And their movement between objects of art and the place that they're housed, and the act of translation that occurs as they cross platforms, kind of creating this time. So the viewer and the flow make the time in the world. I think this image is of a work called YWY by Isidora Pedro Neves Marquez, and I think is a really interesting, a very good example of this. YWY is a fictional character, fictional indigenous robot that Isidora authors in collaboration with the actress who portrays the character. And it's become manifest in multiple exhibitions alongside the poetry that Isidora writes, but also in a lot of books and other printed matter. And I think it's a kind of an interesting example of how audience time is kind of generated as they kind of actively kind of invest in works across platform. But the kind of second part, fandom, if we take with us for a second the kind of idea of the audience as being very key, I think it's more useful to think about fandom as a kind of, in contemporary art terms, as a question of engagement. And kind of coming back, because, in broader media terms, kind of these bigger media franchises or like big media stories obviously have a much bigger audiences than contemporary art. So the way that fandom is theorized, the way that the idea of engagement with these kind of textual worlds is theorized, is a little bit different to how it might function in contemporary art. But again, the kind of fandom thing also, Henry Jenkins was very key in kind of defining that. In the early 90s, he described fans as readers who are like nomads, poaching their way across fields they do not own. He developed this kind of view of these kind of buccaneering fans who plunder texts and take what they want, reusing and adding where necessary, to make these kind of additive expansions of a story world, so that they might better represent them and their engagement or their interests through this kind of story. But to some degree, this kind of slightly punkish kind of view of fandom has kind of slightly given way, because lots of those fan mechanisms were kind of brought into bigger story worlds and storytelling production. They were kind of brought into the production. Those fans were brought into the production of those worlds. So again, I think the idea of engagement is probably a kind of more useful one. And what I propose that we look at in this regard is the potential to engage the audience with the kind of expanded notion of artistic practice as it crosses platforms and media. And I think two really nice or kind of effective examples of this are David Blandy's tabletop role-playing games, particularly the one that he made for The World After, which was an exhibition at Focal Point Gallery. And the exhibition manifested, as a lot of his exhibitions do, with a kind of video installation. But the video was kind of talked about like ecological disaster, and was kind of based in these marshes that were in Essex, near Focal Point Gallery. But alongside the video, he developed this tabletop role-playing game with a group of local Canby Island tabletop role-playing gamers. And the game existed in the gallery space. And interestingly, obviously, what it does is it creates this, because of the nature of tabletop role-playing games where you have to invent narrative, invent stories. It kind of created this space within his exhibitions which could be continually expanded by anybody who came and played this game. And equally, Anna Debo and Eloise Bonvio have been doing a lot of work they do these big yearly kind of online simulator, like gaming simulator, community building kind of sessions, where they will take an online simulator and they invite a lot of people, often in the context of a kind of cultural institution, and they'll spend like some days working out how you might build community in this online simulator. And I think these are, both kind of useful examples of thinking about how people may engage within that kind of story production of like an artist's practice and allow an artist to kind of expand a story world. So this idea also kind of plays into the notion of not necessarily fandom, but the idea of an audience as actively kind of following the work that an artist makes. And this is kind of just relevant now because obviously we exist in a media landscape where people do much more actively follow what artists do. And so a transmedial story world acknowledges this kind of engagement, and I propose that an artistic world should do the same, even if this is on a kind of micro level, thinking about expanding through networks of peers and small audiences, generating a kind of an investment in the ideas at hand from both audience and author by blurring this kind of strict rule. So, thirdly, in completing this proposed view of transmedia storytelling as a methodology for world building in practice, I want to think about what Elizabeth Evans described as editability. So in a way to track this kind of simple connections between these defining characteristics is again an idea built around audience, like the audience as the kind of key activator in turning practice into world. So in storytelling, editability kind of overlaps a bit with engagement and fandom. I think probably simplistically it could be understood as being a kind of canonical intervention with the story world, or more likely to be a canonical intervention, by which I mean that it's probably an engagement that has been facilitated quite strongly by the author. So in contemporary art terms, I kind of propose that we see this as a question of porosity, a question of what can kind of pass in and pass out of the storied space of the exhibition. In this way, it's kind of, again, the blurring of this kind of primary-secondary world logic, where the world of the work exists in the space of the exhibition, but could live on and therefore expand this kind of storied rationale as it passes outside that space. And again, I mean, I think this kind of manifestation can be seen in David Blandy's work, in the moment in which the tabletop role-playing games rules are made available online via kind of tabletop role-playing websites, so you could download them, and they're the moment in which people then play them outside of his exhibition in their home, like the story world expands in a way that's kind of goes beyond his practice or expands his practice out into some primary world. And it can also be seen in like other kind of quite recent examples, like Atelier EB's kind of fictional clothing brand, where the kind of iconographies that are present in the clothes that are in the space of exhibition and often authored in collaboration with people who are invited, the moment that they are sold and then they leave the exhibition, this kind of storied instance, which is often also like further defined in the catalogues that coincide with the collections, suddenly kind of leave this space and they kind of build this other, they kind of place this story world within this kind of other space of our real world. And again, we can also see it with Isadora in their kind of poetry works. So like, I think it's quite evident in the series Sex is Care, which you could see in galleries, and you can also buy it as a collection of books, and you can also wear it. You know, and obviously, and that collection of poems is not just like a collection of poems, it's also a sort of a suggestion of the production of a kind of world which may be more kind of generous and a bit more pluralistic in its voices. So this porosity then kind of allows for a certain sort of slippage in which the artist and us as kind of active members of an audience may take up the work, and it may be kind of used to break down these kinds of paradigms, encouraging more kind of voice. And crucially, editability in application to kind of creative practice should allow for some room to feed back into the world like the world of the work as a whole, to actively contribute to it through expanding the logics of its own production. Both, therefore, kind of author and the audience may expand this kind of act of world building across platforms. So, I'm going to just talk a little bit about my work before we end, and I'll do it quite quickly because, you know, time's moving on. So the way I've been thinking about this, I was writing a series of stories as a kind of collection of short flash fictions, which were all about artisans who produced simulations for other people, for clients. So they were all like trompe-l'oeil painters or wood inlayers, and they, in their lives, they kind of built these things that created these worlds for those who paid them. And in this kind of fictional structure that I was building, there's this moment that's referred to only as the stop, and it's a kind of unspecified global halt. And after this, the protagonists in the stories, these kind of builders of world, have to work out how to do that for themselves. And one of the stories in that collection I've used to kind of test these logics of story expansion and kind of world building more heavily. And it's a story called The New Adolescence, which imagines this, and I was kind of basically imagining like what would a group of adolescents born into this condition who identify with kind of ideas of like culture, like highly, what would they do? And so I took this kind of story, and I was and I built this mythology around it, and I created this series of different groupings of adolescents who'd all kind of scavenged these kind of ruins of what had come before, the kind of cultural reference points that they used to kind of build these identifiers, these kind of aesthetic identifiers, as clothing and other kind of like banners. And they kind of adopted this kind of aesthetics of kind of new medievalism. And I've run this through a few projects in the last sort of 6 months. The first was a Black Tower project, which was an event, and I invited the artist Louis and Marcelin to run a LARP there. And we invited a group of people, and in the LARP was the live action role play, was designed to kind of make sure that each participant who they were each given a grouping within this collection of new adolescents. They kind of stayed somewhat in character, and throughout the kind of day that we did this, we developed a kind of performance, a musical kind of storytelling performance, and formed a kind of an imagined band. Who played like a half an hour song. And the second most recent and slightly more complicated installment of this happened Chemist Gallery, which is just near here. And this is what I've just taken down. And this show was kind of based around a story, an expansion story of these new adolescents, based on two characters from two different groupings called Win and Calla, who end up in a kind of romantic relationship, and they run off and find this kind of third space. And in this third space, they use this kind of generative space to build world together. And within the structure of the exhibition, I was interested in what happens, again, when you kind of invite people in to expand on this kind of storied logics. So we instigated a series of events. The first was a kind of writing event, where we invited people to come and we kind of set out a series of logics based on the mythology and the groupings, and people took part in kind of writing new stories within this world. The stories were published in a zine at the end. And then the other kind of other main events were I kind of considered as inhabitation. So I invited people who were largely kind of involved in making themselves. And I said to them, look, have this, read the mythology and read all this surrounding material in the stories and produce something in the storied world of the exhibition that expands on its content. So the first inhabitation was by Martha McGuinn, who runs a fabricator called Jamp Studio, who produces a lot of work for kind of quite high-end work for artists. And she built this amulet, which was kind of, this armature, sorry, which was kind of imagined as a piece of kind of expanded costume in the world. The second was inhabitations by Maito Joby Duval and Gabriel Stones, who make computer games, and they designed a computer game based around the new adolescence, in which you kind of took on the role of a new adolescent and you explored within this kind of game environment the kind of immediate surroundings of the house of this inhabitant, and it was a kind of script-based game, so you had a bunch of opportunities to speak to other new adolescents who were kind of roaming around this virtual world. And the third inhabitation was by Thomas Grogan, who used VR to kind of design this series of speculative staircases that he imagined in the world, and he spent the day carving this out virtually. He built this tiny staircase, which he 3D printed. And then it ended in an event where we had readings and another performance by the band. And in the end, so, for me, the point of this was, and to kind of come back maybe to the title of this talk tonight, was to think about, if we're going to talk about futurity, and if we're going to think about how, within these contexts, we might imagine a future, then I think, and contemporary art could be useful in it, then I think we need to create situations in which that can happen as a kind of collective expression of world building. So basically, it was a space in which those ideas of expansion could be tested. And I think I'm going to end there so that we can...
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Can I just see if people already have questions available around? Nope. Okay, so this is why I'm here, so a bit of time filling. All right. So I think let's start from. I think the life world, the world building thing, and storytelling. I was very grateful for your initial explanation of what's, because it's a word that's used a lot in contemporary at the minute. And everyone's like, yeah, world building, it's great. And it seems to kind of be acting as a solution to a set of like problems we haven't really explained what the problems are. But world building at the moment seems to be the thing that people are really into,
Yeah.
to kind of take us to the next point and give some sort of currency, and it's a bit like something has been exhausted in contemporary art, and world building is the answer to that. Right? We're not sure quite what the exhausted thing is,
Yeah.
but world building is kind of, and I think you explained very well the way in which engagement with the audiences, the kind of construction of environments, essentially, or kind of spaces that people can occupy on their own terms, the way it kind of intersects with other forms of media. So maybe there's something about the way in which contemporary has gone from this fairly marginalized and obscure thing to now being quite like a venue for cultural production that intersects, interfaces with lots of other types of media, so it's fashion, video, movies, not so much movies, but some other
Fashion,
media.
yeah.
Okay, TikTok.
Yeah.
Just blame TikTok for everything. And so world building can act as a kind of way of speaking to the expansion of contemporary art, which has been through Frieze Week, which is another way in which contemporary art has been commercialized and becomes part of another culture which art is no longer in charge of, subordinated to. And maybe there's something in world building which lets us think about how to deal with it in a more productive way, right? And then I think I think the thing around storying to me sounded suspiciously like narrative, but maybe we can come back to that. So my question is really about, I guess, two things. One is to do with forms of engagement, and the other one is to do essentially with the break with the notion of autonomy, which I know is a modernist notion, but I think it's still around in terms of critical claims around art against other stuff, right? So to come back to the engagement issue, it seemed to me that when you're talking about the way in which thinking of art practices as forms of world building or storying, which develop and evolve, just depending on lots of contingencies, like what are the objects, who are the actors, did this person turn up? If they didn't, they couldn't have contributed to that thing, which became quite important to the development of the piece as a whole. There's something very different in that evolving model of an artwork, or the real-time development of what the artwork is and what emerges from it. Something very different to that than putting something on a wall and just leaving it there for 3 or 4 weeks while you go off and do other things. And that's kind of more the standard notion that we've inherited through not even just modernity, or modernism, but even maybe pre-modernism, I don't know. Certainly I think like the move from modernism to contemporary art involved this object just existing on its own terms. And what you're suggesting is a much more kind of ongoing, like you have to be in the space, not all the time, but quite a lot, seeing what people are contributing, find ways for people to record their responses to what the environment that's being set up, and then they become actors in that environment themselves and so on. So I guess the first thing was really, there seemed to be something in that and your notion of exhibition time and how you're describing exhibition time, which seemed to collapse the difference between a curator and an artist. Right? So historically, or in the modern model, like the artist would be the person who makes the work, delivers it to the exhibition space, maybe contributes to the decision about its sightedness, where it sits in space or on the wall or whatever. How to deal, if you're showing video or moving image, how to deal with like sound flooding of the space. But really the curator makes those decisions in the end because they're thinking about the whole thing. And there was something around the exhibition time and the storying of how people move around a space, engage with objects, build their own stories of what it is to be in the exhibition, which seems to me actually historically, again, a curatorial, the kind of imperative of the curator. But you're saying, no, this is actually something artists are now doing as fundamental to what the work is. I was wondering for you what happens to that, very institutionalized here. There's like 2 MFAs, one in fine art, one in curating. Fine art, one makes stuff. The curating one tries to think about how to show stuff. Just simplifying what we do a little bit for the sake of getting to the point. Does that still seem a kind of salient difference in, like, if you imagine like a world full of world-making art, would there still be this difference, or do you just think it's
well,
like it's
I think
dated?
it's I just think it probably generates. I mean, on a really practical level, I don't think it's really a question of actually an artist being able to do all of that work themselves. I think it is a fundamentally the act of making world is a kind of collaborative act. So it's not that you kind of like, perhaps it might feel, that my suggestion is the results in the artist kind of claiming territory. Perhaps they do claim some territory there, but that's perhaps okay as well. But I think more than that, it's about kind of thinking collectively about how you use this kind of exhibition form as an opportunity to make something with also the people who come, and that's I think should be kind of probably of fundamental importance for all of those who are involved in the exhibition's production, really,
But what happens to the curator in this?
Well, I think they contribute to like the action of like making the world. So I mean, you design stuff as an artist, and you make stuff and you put the thing there. Maybe they don't get to decide the chairs as much. Maybe I decide the chairs more. But it doesn't mean that they don't get to decide like what happens with the kind of events, what happens with like who may be invited, like who comes in, who does the things. I think that's also, and I think a lot of it can occur like also as a conversation. Like I don't think it has to be totally kind of authorial in this way.
Yeah, sure. I get that from the story.
So yeah, I mean, I don't think it's about removing one person. I think it's just about perhaps rethinking the form of engagement or the nature of that working relationship, perhaps a little bit.
Yeah, I guess that's what I was getting to, because it's still around with a lot of artists that in a way the curator is this kind of secondary thing that arrives after all the hard work of art making has been done, and the curator somehow turns it into something that works well in the space, or kind of occasionally you still hear about resentments about how curators dominate what the artwork is doing or turn it into what they want it to be and not what the artist wants it to be. There seems to be something in your suggestion of ongoing world making rather than just representing a world, right? So there's nothing representational in this. You don't give a finished picture. The picture is made, or the story is made through the interactions, which seem to kind of you can't really have a primary or secondary actor in it.
No.
Right.
No, it's kind of, but maybe it's more of an ensemble.
An ensemble
Piece.
Okay. But nonetheless, the artist is the one that sort of sets up the score.
But then I think in a way, I don't think that is. I suppose the thing is, right, I think it's kind of framing the way that it exists, because on one level, the project becomes curatorial in the sense that there are multiple actors, right, who enter into the space and produce work. So to again make a really like simplistic view of it, it becomes a little bit like a group show, right? Classic like curatorial territory. Solo shows perhaps more classically like artist driven, and I've seen that. I mean, as you say, I was an artist in residence at Palais de Tokyo, and I remember when Philip Perrino did a carte blanche there, and there was very little space for any curator to dictate to him what his carte blanche show was, there was him, all him. So, I don't think that in itself is like totally new, but I think it's the kind of way probably that you work with the idea of other actors that kind of forms this engagement between artist and curator,
Do you think that's why world building might be quite hot at the moment, because there is a sense of collaboration?
I mean, I think that's certainly, I think, as I said, the reason why I disambiguated world building a little bit is because I think often it's used in a slightly like confused, or like those things, the elements that make it up interconnect, but I think often people use it in a slightly like to kind of try to catch all of those things, But yeah, I think world building is a kind of an interesting idea, partly because it's hot because people like computer games, that's definitely a big part of it, and like a lot of world building is theorized in cyber world design. So that's definitely a part of it. But yeah, it does also within the kind of politics of care that we've kind of been interested in, I think, in the art world for equally kind of probably the last 5 years particularly. I think it offers a kind of a mode of operation which can allow people, and also because, you talk about the curator, but the other thing that the curator does is, the other classic issue is a kind of, opposition of hierarchy, where you get to kind of validate who is, good enough to be in a certain place, So, and within the kind of logics of this politics of care, of course, you might break down some of that hierarchy a little bit. So I think that is an interesting world building.
All right. I've got another question, but let me just see if there's anybody. Oh, okay. There's 2, 3. Was there one over there? Okay, so maybe move the mic to.
Hi. Can you hear me?
No, it's not on.
Hello?
Yes.
Hi, thank you so much for the talk. I kind of wanted to make a statement, which I was hoping that you comment on, about time management, and also about this idea of primary and secondary sources in terms of world building to create not just a coping mechanism, but to open out for a potential future. And it's world building is something that I'm really interested in, and it's actually something that I've turned away from, mainly to do with time management. So these kind of artists that you look at that do world building, like Tyler Shani or Mariana Simonette or Bunny Rogers, it takes up a lot of time, because this idea of the artist as individual, where that idea is kind of dominated also by the art market. It means that you just think that you do everything yourself. You make the sculpture, you make the video, you make this, you make that, you make this, and you don't have any time to go. Sorry, this is really long, but you don't have any time to leave the studio. And the more that happens, I worry that you fall into more this kind of secondary source, and then you end up falling into just total fantasy. So it's no longer productive in the way that writers can be. And I was thinking about things like writers like Ursula Le Guin and Octavia Butler, and they are incredibly effective in presenting a new kind of world that we can, have a lot of hope for, and I think that's why it's so popular right now. But writers usually write for 4 hours a day, and then they take breaks, and they do things, and I think that's a huge problem about artists, and artists trying to do things on their own, and and that, finishing up, what I quite liked was about that kind of collaboration more with other artists, and that just not trying to do things all on your own, as a way to stop using world building just as a coping mechanism, but as a potential future.
Yeah, thank you. I suppose on one level I think this is like the kind of labour thing, the kind of artist's labour is like a problem that, that's like a fundamental problem that obviously, like, whether your like interest like in production is within world building or just anything else, it's like this is like a problem within art, like people don't get paid very much, and it requires them to make a lot of work, to put a lot of work into doing something. I mean, I don't know. I mean, the thing about the distinction between artists and writers, I don't know, because I think that a lot of writers who don't have the capacity to have don't have the publishing contracts that, Ursula Le Guin still teaches, so she was never making any money, like being a writer, she was an academic, because it was a way for her to earn a living. So she was, alongside having a family, was writing at night, to write these books. So I don't know if I feel that, I think this is like a problem with like creative practices more broadly, is like about how you would earn a living, right? I don't know if that, I don't know. So then, to address the idea that like, do you kind of slip into this secondary world? Perhaps, but also perhaps the kind of, the most productive view of the secondary world would be that if you act collectively in its production, that the art can have the porosity for that secondary world to kind of influence the kind of primary world, or like ideas of how you live, like our ideas of what we do, So in a way, I think there's perhaps some value to kind of to creating something in that space, if that makes sense.
There's another question, but I before we get to that, I had that more as a question about efficiency in a way.
Okay.
Which is basically like, it can be really exhausting to do world building on your own.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
And it seemed to me that the writer was kind of being put forward as a more efficient way to kind of make it work.
Yeah.
But the writer, as long as they're not having to deal with the freaking seat system, a friend told me. Then you've got time to do the work. But when you're spending your morning going like, how the fuck does this work? Then it kind of gets in the way of the writing. But I thought there was a response maybe available through the transmedia moment as well, because there seemed to be something about the generation of. My second question, which I'll leave for the moment, seemed to be actually other people can also make bits of the world.
Yeah.
Like through fan responses.
Yeah.
And so on. But the transmedia seemed to suggest that, and my sense is it doesn't happen so much in art as it happens in more commercialized types of world building, where they really kind of put a big effort to get a lot of like fan or audience response. And then so when you're talking about a second screening, which is like fan comments, so I was thinking of like Watch Party on Netflix. Is it that? Yeah, Netflix, I think. And so, people kind of having a watch party, they're kind of texting each other on the app or whatever. But it's clear that at some point, some of that's going to be skimmed to kind of generate new TV series at some point down the road. So this is content generation for free.
Yeah.
In fact, you're paying to generate content for Netflix, who are then going to make more money off you to generate more content. So we're working not just for free, but we're paying to generate content. But that's kind of gratifying in a sense if your ideas are being taken up.
Yeah, that's the classic fan position.
Yeah,
obviously.
So just to do the world building thing in relation to this, there seems to be some. It's almost like the commercial moment of world building seems to be far more efficient in terms of doing the kind of world building thing than. Yeah, I know Thai a little bit, so I've heard stories about like it's a lot of work to get those costumes, to get those.
Yeah.
Think of the script, think of the performance, deal with the whole thing, but it's whether the artist is prepared to let others take their voice.
Yeah.
This isn't a criticism of Thai at all, but
no.
more just like the form of art.
Yeah.
So just.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't even think even in a kind of micro scale. I said this to you earlier when we met. Like, even in a scale of a small production, to do all of the parts yourself is just kind of it's ineffectual, I think, because it's like you just don't get the most out of the potential of.
We're still being a traditional artist, right? You're still the autonomous artist.
Yeah. You're just producing things, and then you want people to kind of come and look at them. But the whole thing is that you don't just want people to come and look at the thing. You want people to come and like be like a part of producing the thing. So in a way, yes, it is a more kind of effective, perhaps use of your labour to build such a structure. I think Thai's kind of interesting. Her work is really good. But I think kind of interestingly, she fits very much within this whole kind of conversation. I think she has, and obviously lots of things are produced by other people. I think that functions in a more traditional manner in which like sculptures are produced by people, things are produced, and I don't think for someone who kind of builds world as much as she does. She kind of got quite engages with this kind of active, like collaborative world building, called collective world building, as much as some of these other people that I mentioned. I think that's also, obviously partly to do with, that's obviously partly to do with what she wants to do in her work, and also other external factors of what other people want her to do with her work. But yeah, I mean, certainly, I think it's a productive way to think about like your time and your kind of your health, your like ability to do anything, essentially to do things together somewhat.
All right. So the question there, and then there was one here, and I've just seen a couple more, but let's take these. Go ahead.
Hello, thanks for your talk. So my question is quite quick. I was wondering, when you talk about collective and collaborative way of world building, how do you sign it? Like, do you sign? Is it your work? Is it part of your CV? You know what I mean? Like all these things that everyone is making.
Yeah. I mean, it's so. What I try to do. I mean, it's a good kind of practical question and it's something I think about when I do them. I mean, so probably what I will do is, for example, a show like the one that's just happened, I announced it as being, as being my show alongside the person who did most of the programming as co-authors. Even so, I did most of the making of these works, not that being my kind of, and I authored most of the original stories, and then she did most of the kind of programming, inviting people in, and then those people who kind of came in more kind of momentarily, they're kind of, they were are announced as being part of that exhibition. So it's kind of existed as kind of having these two authors with then these other people who are contributing to the exhibition. That's sort of how I, in the last instance, kind of reconcile that situation. Which is not to say it's the best way to do it. I don't know. That's a kind of a bit of an ongoing thing, and I think it depends a bit on how much labor, what people are doing in it, really.
So it crediting roles,
Yeah, exactly.
Filmmaking.
Yeah.
That's
All right, there's a question in the middle. Can you just pass the mic along to help out? And then after that, there's a question at the back. Can you put your hand up so you can see where? There's a question over there somewhere? Yeah.
Hello.
Thanks for the talk. Super interesting. I don't know exactly where. I've got a lot of thoughts, but I think the thoughts center around this question of the quality of the art that is being made, and how much the participators in the world are, regular members of the public, or other artists who have specializations in craft, or the particular medium that is being practiced. What happens to the essence of the art object in transmedia art forms, or is it kind of a world in itself with a lot of different possibilities?
So I think for me, it's kind of I'm really interested in actually in the kind of production of exhibitions. I think that's, I realize that is my kind of, my main kind of focus in the idea of the exhibition as this space which can house objects of art which are hopefully qualitatively interesting, but that the objects of art are kind of justified by this storied logic rather than by a logic, based on whatever other externals you may choose to make, so that this kind of defined story logic kind of leads the production. So hopefully those objects have a kind of qualitative, are qualitatively resonant to people. And then but more interestingly, I suppose, in terms of the other people, because of course I make the work that I make, but so obviously some of this kind of theoretical logic particularly that around engagement and fandom, comes from, as I said, like these kind of much bigger things where you'll have like people, if you've ever read fan fiction, it will really, really range in quality, but the thing in art I've noticed in testing some of this a little bit is that it has a very small audience who kind of are really aware of its logics and its rules and like what to do in it, like, or what they think they should do in it. So you could certainly have bad things that could be made in it, but in a way, like for me, when I kind of, obviously in the project I've just showed, there were kind of two things, and I think the writing part is the part that was the most open, the other part was kind of by necessity, was sort of most planned, let's say. So the writing was kind of the most open, and the inhabitations were the most planned, just through necessity. And you read the writing, and it's kind of varied. But for me, like that kind of quality, like that kind of qualitative judgment of that writing is not super important in that context. I think what's interesting is the idea that you, also in that kind of setting, end up having conversations with people about this thing, and you might be having a conversation with someone and they might not write something you think is incredible, but they might also say, this was really amazing because I don't know, I was talking to someone who was like, it really made me think about like my experience like through COVID, right? And like this kind of stop, and then kind of like, the kind of world after this thing. So, it was kind of a quite a generative space, because they kind of produced this thing which came from an interesting place and was kind of housed within this story, like it kind of contained it, gave like a place for it to be. And it obviously, from my perspective, it doesn't like dominate the exhibition either, so it kind of just becomes part of this kind of bigger like effort, like doing something together. So I think, quality is kind of important in the show, but also the openness is kind of finding ways for that to like manifest, I think.
All right, there's a question over there, and I saw one down here from those two, and then there's a couple
It
of
often seems in like world building and contemporary art, we're kind of lazily smuggling in practices from role playing, film, advertising.
Why
futurism.
why lazily?
Because they're often concluded with a much less rigorous sense of world. So it often feels like they're gestures towards these things that are coming, and I would say often much more successfully completed in other forms of cultural production. So I guess my question is, what is the value of bringing in those practices to the art world, rather than just say going and hanging out with a bunch of LARPers who want to be in a post-dystopian society of adolescents? And secondly, is there a inherent value or a supposed value in this relationship between some sort of political project of now that is somehow, I don't know, empowered by imagining a specific future?
I mean, I've certainly kind of, I think it's an interesting question, like, this kind of, like, again, a kind of qualitative question, I think, that you're asking about, like, where could you most effectively produce these things? Why would contemporary art be a useful place to produce it? In a way, I think equally, like, contemporary art, like, as a kind of, as a thing, I think largely operates by kind of making, by having the freedom to make certain associations between various cultural objects. Therefore, I think it has the space to do that, and it doesn't do it as well. Like, for example, in gaming, most of the games that are built in contemporary art are clearly not as good, like good, as games that are built by studios for whom that is their entire like reason to be. But it doesn't mean that like placing a game in a like building a game in this kind of story world doesn't facilitate certain conversations and within the space of the exhibition that wouldn't happen within that kind of gaming context, right? So I think there is kind of like a value to using those tools because of what contemporary art kind of is and can do, and you know, and if contemporary art is looking to kind of ask questions of like maybe, I suppose, as this series of talks is to like what do we do, then like I think it's kind of quite justifiable to use all kind of mediums that it can to kind of ask those questions. And there was a question around the political project, which...
Or maybe can I just follow up on it? Because it seems to me when you're comparing the games that are kind of produced in the contemporary art spaces, often which are collaborative with the, like you would describe David Blandy's thing, working with some D&D folks in somewhere in Essex, and developing the game together with them. And the other practice you're showing as well, there seems to be something to do with the exhibition space. You've said the size of the art world isn't that big compared to like the commercial systems, the other commercial systems. There seems to be something quite important about intimacy and a kind of setting up forms of relationship for the duration of the world and the world making, or through the world making, and a form of collaboration, again, to go back to that term, which seems to be very different to the way that it's set up in like commercial gaming, right? So those things are road tested like through and through. You get rid of all the boring scenarios, you kind of keep it in. You know, so there's kind of very strong pre-selection of what survives in the final commercial product, which, and even then the kind of making of it has entirely kind of corporate logic to it, even for the Smith Studio, I think. Whereas in these ones, the kind of relationships that are set up and the kind of personalization of the making seems very important for you. So would that be part of the political?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that is the politics of it. Is this idea of like making a space to house people, and it's in that kind of space of like storytelling that you can kind of think up something together, and it's kind of passing that period of time. And that is sort of the politics of the logics of the work, I think.
All right. So we're getting close to 7, and I feel like Theo's kind of losing.
10 past 7, actually.
Is it 10 past 7? So let's take 2 questions here, and then I saw 2 questions at the back. So we just take these 2, and Theo can answer both of them. We'll move them to the top. Go ahead, please. Yeah.
I was just right at the end of your talk, you mentioned something about how a lot of these sort of collaborative world building experimental sort of things happen in online spaces.
Can you hold the mic a bit closer?
Yes. It happened in online spaces. And that's something which for me particularly is not especially intuitive. So I was just wondering like what you find like interesting about, like you're saying, this transmedia practice of you're making objects, you're also writing. This sort of makes sense to me. How like you can like come together with people in a physical space. How do you sort of cross over between the online spaces and the physical spaces and sort of bring those things together to build some kind of community, however temporary that may be, for whatever purpose it may be?
All right, so it's about the transmediality. Yeah, just take the second. Okay, but there's one behind you as well. All right.
Hello. I had a couple of questions, but I'll try to be really short. So I've actually been in the sort of transmedia storytelling world for a while now. And I guess I was like sort of drawing on the question before, but less about the kind of like taking mediums from places that that sort of side of cultural production, more thinking about it in terms of methodology, because I'm just thinking that the motivations for doing a lot of those things in other contexts are really, really different. So for example, that idea of when you were sort of talking about the story about time across the different pieces, I was thinking about the idea of stickiness, of making like a really sticky project that people want to come back to, is something that is talked a lot about in terms of product development. wondering how you sort of translate that yourself, like into an artistic practice. What does that come back then mean when it doesn't, like, yeah, what does it mean? Where does it sort of go? And then like, yeah, just a couple of kind of like questions just from, I suppose, I was wondering how if you would relate this to like a kind of participatory practice or even sort of like relational art practice, because particularly around the question of like where does the content go, how important is the content? So people make up the story, but then at the end of the workshop everybody goes, like, is that story ever read, does it matter? That seems quite important. And then I think kind of come just, you know, the basic problems that we would always deal with in a lot of these projects as well. I just wanted to ask you about things like audience drop-off rate, for example. So you're not, like, people aren't coming to see all of this stuff. So you've got this wonderful perspective as the, you know, the eye over the head. I built this well, but actually individual visitors may be coming today or a moment. So how do you feel about that?
All right, that might be enough. That's quite a lot to take on. So do you want to take up the transmedia thing between exhibition and online?
Yeah. I mean,
that as well.
yeah, the online space thing, you know, is I think it's a good question because it's not something. Like personally, I find like I am very much more interested in how, like on just really a personal level, in how those things, those interactions, and how things are expanded when they happen in the gallery, rather than moments where they occur online. Because they allow this kind of potential to have a conversation about this world, and it feels to me much more generative as a space. You know, the online thing is just a thing where it feels like it can't exist without kind of without being online to some degree. You know, on a practical level, I think it needs to be, and it will end up existing online, you know, like on a simple level. Afterwards, it will exist online before it's being advertised online. So I think, you know, there's a kind of logic to kind of exploring what then can be generated online. But I don't, in my experience of doing it a little bit, and it's not my main focus, but is that I don't find it as rewarding a space for producing this stuff. But then again, that probably comes back to the fact that like I'm fundamentally quite interested in exhibition production. So, you know, I'm kind of coming from that place, so I probably find it the more rewarding because of that. Yeah, and then the transmedia questions. Yeah, there's a huge drop off. I mean, that's like, you know, when you run these things, you'll obviously have more people coming to certain things. People won't come to all the things. Some people will come a couple of times. One of the things I enjoy about transmedia storytelling, you know, theoretically, particularly in its kind of founding, is the idea that you don't necessarily need to be present or understand all of the logics in the story world to access some part of the story world. So I kind of take that, you know, which was kind of Jenkins's thing, and I kind of think that that's kind of true. So what I try to provide is, in the space of the exhibition, you have this kind of story world that's outlined. You have this kind of mythology, you have these objects, and you might come there and it's just an exhibition, and when there's nothing happening in the exhibition, there's just like a story that's being told, like an audio story that's being told. And then in other moments the exhibition is being kind of activated by these inhabitants, and they will bring probably bigger audiences, often because they also bring their own audiences. And again, we're talking on this micro scale of like, you know, artists, like artistic spaces where like, you know, they're kind of happy if they get like 12 people in a day, you know, that'd be really great, you know. So, you know, so there is that kind of thing. And I mean, it is just, I think when you're operating on a kind of small scale, I think it's also just a reality of it in a way. I mean, the stickiness question is a really interesting one because what is it that kind of gets people or could get people kind of hooked into the story world? Therefore, they would come, you know, multiple times. Therefore, they would write and engage with that, and they would come to the events. I mean, again, in the kind of specifics of, you know, of where I've been testing a lot of those logics, a lot of it's about engagement with those people, you know. So we began with a storytelling workshop, for example, because that kind of thing hooks people into the story world because they access the story world in much greater depth than they do if they come to the exhibition. And there is this information, but they probably won't. They will access parts of it. So those people will probably then come more times during the run of the show. Not all of them, of course. Some of them won't, but so that's a really practical answer. But I mean, in a way, it's a practical question, right? Yeah, and then like participatory art, like relational aesthetics. I mean, I think relational aesthetics, the artists involved in relational aesthetics were not particularly interested in the idea of anybody else generating anything in that space. Sorry.
They're very authored.
They're very authored, yeah.
So people come in as, it seems to me people come in as
actors.
Yeah.
And, and as I say, I spent a year at Palais de Tokyo, so I met quite a lot of those people and the people who were involved in that early part, and I'm, I'm a product of that period. I did my BA when relational aesthetics was, just translated into English, and it was huge, right? And so I'm very familiar with it. But I think that, and of course, the kind of participatory elements align with that, to some degree. But I don't think they were really, very interested in anybody else kind of, authoring anything within that space.
This might be a conversation for the bar.
Yeah.
I think. So there's a question of that. You've been very patient. There was another one around that. Okay, so we'll take yours and then the second question and we'll finish.
Hi, thank you. So my question is also a practical one. I'm asking about how to do the setup of time background of world building. Because I'm not about to do a world building installation myself very soon, and I feel that most audience are kind of spoiled by sci-fi movies and war games, and they have taken the hypothesis that they see a new world and it's not really in history, and so it's something happening in the future. But for my own practice, I want to create a kind of ambiguity that it might happen in the future and it might be something has already happened in the past, or there could be a parallel world. So I don't know how to create this kind of ambiguity against audience hypothesis of things happening in the future.
Let's take the second question.
Hi, thank you for the talk. My question is kind of linked to Sarah's question about the director aspect, and I'm quite interested in working collaboratively because I think it's the most sustainable practice, also in terms of time efficiency maybe. But I'm also kind of wondering how it really is a democratic process maybe, and it doesn't become this kind of I'm director and you're kind of instrumentalized, like taking basically turning a participant into an actor or an object almost or something. How do you think it can really be a communal effort, or is it does it become kind of like didactic some certain vision you have? I didn't really understand the slide you kind of showed earlier about the colonial something, but is that also does it become like a kind of colonial kind of way of world making then, or taking space and time and this kind of stuff?
Okay. So maybe can you take up the second question first, because I think it follows on from the previous, and then we'll finish with a question about like the speculative capacities or like the ambiguities in the speculative moment of world building.
I think it's, like working collaboratively is always quite complicated, I think. Like, I don't think there isn't like an answer where I go, the thing is, it's completely, obviously, I'm kind of coming up with this kind of framework, and then I invite people to come and work within this framework, and they produce things, and I try to acknowledge that as effectively as I can, and of course I try to not occupy their time or their labor unduly. But I think a lot of that is also about, like, at a certain moment, I talk about like these kind of micro networks of peers and things like that, and I think, a lot of how I think this can quite effectively function is on a very micro level, where it's like you are also working with people who want to also like work on this thing. So, in this little kind of bit at the end when I talk about stuff I've been doing, this band that we made, continues to exist, right? And it only continues to exist because the people in it were like, hey, maybe we should do this again, right? And I'm really happy about that, because for me it's really interesting. Like, it's nice to like do this thing, and I really find it kind of funny that to be in a band that's imagined as being a group of adolescents, even though everyone in it is about 40. And I think that's kind of funny. But the point is that obviously, they are in it or doing that, contributing to this continued expansion of the world until they don't want to do that, right? And, in a way, but one of the distinctions I would also make, though, is that, like, which I think is kind of not uncommon in kind of transmedial productions, I do hold, obviously, a certain like authorship on this thing, and I am obviously therefore like the person who wrote these stories and the thing, and these are, and then, but what I'm trying to kind of do to address that is that, like, I don't know, if we play a gig, it's going to be the new adolescents, and that's based in my story world. But like, that's, like that needs to be where the focus is. And I think it's about framing, probably, and trying to, from like the perspective of perhaps like the original author, trying to kind of be mindful of the labor that other people are putting in. And to finish, the speculative moment. It's quite difficult to build a kind of speculative world for other people to exist in. I think it's important on a practical level, probably, just to try to, you need to remove people from, I think it's useful to find a mechanism which removes people from like where they are when they come into the space, right? Like, if you're looking to be productive. So the first project I showed at Black Tower, the reason I talk, and the reason that there was this kind of LARP that was designed, was not to have like a really, really thorough LARP, but was just as a way to like break the situation when people come in with all their stuff from daily life, that they struggle to get there. It's in a silly kind of industrial space, like lots of art buildings, it's hard to get to, whatever. And then you kind of break that thing and try to take them into this kind of storied space, which is like another space. So like I think finding like a kind of transition from like primary to secondary world is kind of the key. And you might find that through like, I also try to do it through like the through the very literal physical nature of the exhibition, being quite like an immersive space where like, it's like quite complete. Those are the kind of some of the strategies I use to do that. Obviously within, what you do, it depends what kind of suits, the outcome you're looking for as well.
All right.
Yeah.
I think it's a good point to finish. Thank you for that. It's kind of a very practical way of